All right, should be good to go now. Welcome everyone to this live stream. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to my Patreon supporters. They keep this channel going and make awesome interviews with awesome guests like Dr. W. Richard Oakes Jr. possible. Dr. Oakes earned his PhD in Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. His publications include various articles, essays, and the monograph, The Cross of Christ, Islamic Perspectives, published in 2020. That monograph, of course, is the topic of this interview, as viewers can easily tell, because I shamelessly plagiarized the title for this live stream. So after this interview, head down to the description box where you can find a link to the book as well as more about the author. Rick, welcome.
Good to see you.
A quick note to the viewers. You should know by now, many of you, that I'm very bad at keeping up with the live chat and conducting this interview. But if you do have any questions, I will try to squeeze them in. So make them short, tag me, and make them relevant. And I'll try to get them to Dr. Oakes. And if not, just put them in a comment below the video, and I will try to get to them as best as I can. All right. So, Rick, you did your PhD dissertation in Scotland. So did you pick up any of that Scottish accent?
No, I'm not good at picking up Scottish accents at all. In fact, my son has moved recently to Tennessee, where there's clearly a Southern accent, and I haven't been able to pick up any of that either.
Well, that's a good thing, on the Southern accent at least. Well, I hope none of the viewers were counting on listening to another Andy Bannister. But two American accents for you. Let's start off with your book, Dr. Oakes, the heart of this interview, The Cross of Christ. So this is obviously a lengthy process. Writing a monograph like this takes a couple of years, and I'm certain that some of your conclusions have changed. I'd like to know what some of those are, and then just describe your basic methodology as you went about writing this monograph.
Well, conclusions did change, and they did change more than once in my process. I got interested in the whole topic of the crucifixion of Jesus from a Muslim perspective when I was in seminary, when I went to Talbot School of Theology several years ago. And I sort of got interested because when I learned that Muslims deny the crucifixion, it just really took me off guard. I mean, there are things about Christianity that one can disagree about. You and I may not even agree on what's a proper method of baptism. There's certainly more than one choice available within the Christian church. And so there are disagreements. But the crucifixion isn't the kind of thing that there's really disagreements about. One doesn't find a secular skeptic who would disagree about the crucifixion. It's a well-established historical fact. There'll be disagreements maybe on the resurrection, but certainly not on the crucifixion. So I was just fascinated that Muslims denied the crucifixion. And so that's where I wanted to start my studies. And I read a lot of the literature that was out there. And what then surprised me was that I learned that there were contemporary folks out there, scholars, who were saying that, well, Islam doesn't really deny the crucifixion. There just might be some overlap here, and room for them to agree on the crucifixion. So that's when my study started. And I was actually looking for more accounts than those that were in the literature that might agree with the crucifixion or affirm the crucifixion. And as it turned out, my search for additional confirmation was not fruitful. I did not find any more accounts that confirmed the crucifixion. In fact, what I found is that the accounts that reputedly affirmed the crucifixion, if one really read them a little bit more carefully, it would turn out that no, they really did not affirm the crucifixion. So I ended up with a conclusion that was exactly the opposite of the course I was trying to pursue initially.
So crucial to this denial is Surah 4:157, of course. And in discussing this verse in Muslim commentaries and related verses, we encounter these substitution legends. And you spend a lot of time in your book describing these legends and how they were employed by various commentators. So There are some differences from one legend to the other, but they all have a similar kind of a common storyline. So, for the viewers who haven't heard these substitution legends, or maybe have heard of the phrase but don't know the content, could you please give us that common storyline of these
Sure.
legends?
Sure. The term substitution legend was actually coined by Todd Lawson, who wrote a book about a decade ago. Otherwise, they would just be referred to as traditional reports. Basically, what happens in a substitution legend is that Allah transforms somebody, transforms their physical appearance so much and so convincingly that that person looks so much like Jesus that the Jewish authorities, the high priest and Sadducees and the Sanhedrin, the council and such, they crucified Jesus. They crucified the substitute instead of Jesus because they're confused. And they do this either while or immediately after Allah is raising Jesus to himself or to heaven.
And is there any point, how early are these? Is there any point in the commentaries where you don't see substitution legends used?
No, the simple answer would be no.
Okay.
Substitution legends go back as far as there are explanations of this verse within the Muslim tradition.
Okay. Are there pre-Islamic substitution legends? Can we go back that far?
There are Christians who don't. There are early Christians who did not believe that Jesus had been crucified. Faustus and Pseudo Cyril of Jerusalem both report that Jesus was not really crucified. It looked that way, but he really wasn't crucified. The Acts of John, which is an apocryphal work, never accepted by the church, but nonetheless in circulation for quite some time, it says that somebody in the form and likeness of Jesus was the one who actually died upon the cross. So this gives you the idea of a substitute. Basilides and the second treatise of the Great Seth, they both say that Simon of Cyrene was crucified on the cross and that Jesus was not. So there is material within the Christian tradition that relates to the idea that Jesus was not crucified.
Let's talk about four, let's call them categories of Muslim commentators. So we'll talk about the grammarians, and then we'll talk about some of the rationalists, and Al-Tabari is so important that he gets his own category. And then we'll talk about the Ismaili scholarship. So I think it'll be interesting for the viewers to understand how each category of scholarship dealt with these substitution legends. So you describe the work of some important grammarians. Viewers may know the names Al-Zajjaj and Al-Farah. How do the grammarians, these great grammarians, interact with 4157 related verses and the substitution legends?
Well, it's really two different ways in which they relate to it, and that's really important because there are two terms here in 4157 that appear only in 157 and nowhere else within the Quran. One of the terms is shubiha, and the other one is yakina. So the very last phrase in verse 157 is wama kataluhu yakina. Now, kataluhu usually would mean they killed him. But we have five grammarians who come out and say that whenever the term yakinan is, or whenever kataluhu is combined with the term of knowledge, like yakinan, then you translate it in terms of knowledge rather than in terms of killing. And what it means is that they did not absolutely know it. Now that's an entirely different kind of a meaning than they certainly did not kill him. Most translations reflect the latter. They certainly did not kill him. They treated it as an emphatic denial of the crucifixion. But these five early grammarians all say that it should be translated as they did not know it absolutely certainly. They had doubts. Now, what's particularly interesting about that translation and that meaning is that it perfectly conforms with the four phrases immediately before that that are all in the register of doubt and confusion and disagreement. And so if you translate it the way I'm suggesting here, what you have is five phrases in a row that are all in the same register. They're all talking about the same thing. Whereas if you translate it as they certainly did not kill him, well, that has nothing to do with what's been being talked about over the previous four phrases. Now, these particular grammarians, you can go back to Al-Farah. He's a early 9th century grammarian, and I can name the others, but they're in the book, basically, and they're all early on. They're all important grammarians. Now, there's one other way that grammarians deal with this verse, and that's Makshari, who's one of the most important commentators ever, and he's also a renowned grammarian. He's from Central Asia. He's not from Arabia. He's not from Persia. He's from further east, in the area of the Stan countries between China and Russia, Mongolia. That whole area of the world is where he originates. Now, he asks the question, and it's a very important one. The question pertains to Shubiha, and that's a passive perfect verb. In the past, those particular verbs in Arabic, because they're passive, you can't identify, you can't name the actor. You can't identify, you can't write a sentence where you have the actor followed by a passive verb. It's just not the way that the language is constructed. And so he asks the question, who is the subject or who is the actor? Because he can't be there. And his answer is a very complicated answer, very complicated. There are four different scholars who have explained what he said. Those four cannot agree on whether he comes up with two or three or four different possible answers. That's how complicated his answer is. What's notable about both of the explanations given by these grammarians is that they don't get repeated after their time. These explanations appear in the very earliest commentaries, but they are not picked up subsequently. These are important issues, but what happens is substitution legends squeeze them out, and there's no place left for these lines of thinking.
And what role did the substitution legends play in the grammarians? Did they have a final conclusion? Did these grammatical observations influence them definitively one way or another?
In all cases, all six of these grammarians include substitution legends. The one where it's probably most profound, I think, is in Zamakshari's case. He has four substitution legends. He finds them to be unsatisfactory. So he moves over to this exploring how the grammar works. He gets frustrated with that, and then he reports five more substitution legends, concluding that the last one is probably the best one.
That's interesting. And many Christian viewers, particularly those who are very familiar with exegetical commentaries and so forth, would expect to find some relief when we get to the grammarians based on their method of exegesis versus, of course, the many commentaries that we see in the Muslim tradition are explaining the text with stories, very, very different from what we do with biblical scholarship. So it's very interesting to me when I was reading your book to see that these great grammarians in the end just went with the substitution legends. Very unexpected.
But even going a step further, what's really striking is that the grammarians, particularly the grammarians that are dealing with Kataluhu Yakinan, they did not know it, certainly. What's particularly striking is that modern Arabic dictionaries will use their explanation. So if you didn't have a commentary, but you knew Arabic or you knew it enough so that you could look up the words, you could go to the modern dictionary, and then you would translate the last phrase as they did not know it certainly. You would not translate it as they certainly did not kill him. The dictionaries would lead you in that direction if you didn't have the commentaries. So commentaries actually distract you from the meaning.
Interesting. So sounds like modern Arabic dictionaries have resurrected, no pun intended, the reading of these ancient grammarians.
Well, it is appropriate to bring the term up of resurrection now, isn't it?
Let's move to Al-Tabari, who, as I said, gets his own category because he was so important here. So how did he approach 4157 and related passages, and what was his ultimate conclusion?
Well, with Tabari, we have some idiosyncrasies as well. What most people think of, what most modern Westerns think of when they hear of Tabari, if they're familiar with him, is they think of his commentary. It's the first published commentary that's circulated in the West, and that was because it was subsidized by the royal house of Saud. And it's been in circulation now for just over 100 years, several different printings and slight variations of it. What most people in the West aren't as familiar with, and I use the term loosely because most people aren't even familiar with Tabari, but those who are familiar with Tabari, what's most notable is that is his history. He is most famous for writing a history of princes and prophets. It's 39 or 40 volumes, and in printed form takes a couple of bookshelves. It's very, very extensive, and that's what he's most famous for. Now, he doesn't say the same thing in his history as he does in his commentary. That should be striking. In his history, he includes half a dozen reports. A couple of his reports talk about Jesus having a ministry, a 3-year ministry, and then dying at age 30 or age 33. 4 of his commentaries are traceable to Ibn Ishaq. Ishaq is the author of the most important biography of Muhammad. He's one of the most credible people in Islamic literature. So he's got 4 reports from Ishaq, all of which say that Jesus was crucified in the afternoon. One of them specifies at 3 o'clock. The other says that he was dead for 7 hours and then rose. And so this is what he reports in his history. But you go to his commentary when he focuses on 4:157, he has 11 reports there, all of which are substitution legends. And interestingly, Tabari was also a compiler of hadiths. He had his own compilation of hadiths that had several thousand hadiths. These would be reports that you can trace all the way back to Muhammad or to the companions. Not one of these 11 reports was a hadith. They were substitution legends. They were stories that were not credible enough to make it into his hadith compilation. So what does he do at the end of his 11 reports? He has to choose one of them. He chooses one by Wahb bin Munabi, who's an early 8th century, not a companion, but a successor to the companions. He's a Jewish convert. He's from Yemen. And what Tabari says is that he's an eyewitness, and so I will trust his report. Keep in mind here that he died 7 centuries after Jesus' crucifixion. So he wasn't exactly an eyewitness. His people may have been eyewitnesses because they were Jews. But still, 7 centuries means you've got to pass this through 20 people before it gets all the way down to Wahb. The report includes the notation that Jesus was taken out of the house where his 17 disciples were present. So one might question that account as well. But that's the account that Tabri chooses as being his favorite account.
So it sounds like possibly, this may not be very charitable, but he had a conclusion and he was looking for confirmation of the conclusion. Seems to be. Because we'd have to explain him leaving aside everything in his history.
It's really hard to explain why he would ignore the 4 reports he had from Ibn Ishaq that confirmed the crucifixion that he's already reported in his history book. That's the most famous history book in Islam. He completely ignores them, and then he chooses this report from Wahb. Now, you get a second problem here with Wahb, and that is that the first 2 reports are from the same guy. In today's world, if you called me to testify on some case at a jury trial, and I gave a report to you, and then the cross-examiner came up, and I gave an entirely different report to him, how would you choose which one to believe? Well, you'd most likely just dismiss me as a witness altogether and say, I've got a clear case of perjury in one case or the other. Lock this guy away. But no, Tabri chooses one of the reports.
It's fascinating. That's sort of perhaps kind of a internally incoherent methodology about Tabri takes us to the next question. Out of all the Razis out there, and let's talk about Fakhruddin al-Razi. This is someone I mentioned kind of the internal conflict because al-Razi offers some very powerful objections against these substitution theories. And a lot of viewers, I think, will sympathize with them. Before we get to al-Razi, though, Sahih Luke has a question. He was wondering about Todd Lawson's work, who we're also able to, or going to bring up soon, so this question fits right in. He says, in Todd Lawson's work, he notes a couple Muslim exegetes that point out, according to grammar, that Jesus was made to look like someone else, not the other way around. Are you familiar with that? I don't recall that from Lawson.
I think where that comes up is in Zamakhshari. Zamakhshari says that the language, if you follow proper grammar, what you would have to conclude is that Jesus is the one that is transformed into the image of somebody else. And the reason he heads in that, and he doesn't like that conclusion, which is why he goes back to reporting some more substitution legends. Now, the reason grammar would lead you in that direction is that there's nobody named in the Quran that could have been transformed into the image of Jesus. So the only way you could then interpret Shubiha is to reverse that and say that it was Jesus who is the one who is transformed into someone else's image. Mm-hmm. Jesus is the only one who is Jesus is the immediately preceding noun. Pronouns refer to the immediately preceding noun. Therefore, Jesus is the one who is transformed into the image of somebody else. That appears to be nonsense. And so Zamakhshari moved on to some more substitution legends.
Yeah, I can see why he would. If Jesus was transformed into someone else, then why would he have been crucified? That seems to be odd. But let's go back to al-Razi. Can you give us an overview of al-Razi's arguments?
Razi's got 2 different sections where he comments about the crucifixion. One is in verse 355 and the other is in 4157. In 4157, he does exactly like all the other Quranic commentators do. He has 6 substitution legends. So everybody's got substitution legends there, but he goes to, in 355, he takes an approach that I'm not aware that there's any other Islamic commentator who is taking this approach. He has 6 arguments against the crucifixion. 6 reasons why this could, why the substitute. I'm sorry, has 6 arguments against substitution legends. He says that they're just plain incoherent. What he does is 4 of his arguments are real. 2 of them are repetitions of arguments that Ibn al-Rawandi and Razis had previously uttered. The first one has overlap with several of the later ones. His first argument starts by saying that transforming somebody into the likeness of another is sophistry. And that just naturally leads to a domino effect, where, first of all, that if you can't, firstly, you can't trust your senses. If you can't trust your senses, then what can you trust? The companions of Muhammad, if they couldn't trust their sense perception, well, maybe they really didn't even see Muhammad, and therefore we can't really know whether Muhammad ever existed. And if Muhammad didn't exist, well, then how can we have Sharia law? And if you can't trust your senses, you can't then have a principle of mutawatir, which is a principle of multiple lines of transmission of these stories that authenticate them. If you have a story that's passed down through several lines of transmission, that's more credible in the Islamic view than if you just have a story that's passed down through one line. And then ultimately, if the companions could not have actually seen Muhammad, then there's no prophet of Islam. And so one tenet of the faith after another is just ripped out of the core of their doctrine if in fact Allah is transforming people and you can't trust your senses. Now that's the first argument. The next ones I'll go through a little bit more quickly. The second one is that the angel Gabriel had enough power in the tips of his wings that he could protect everyone on earth, or he could kill everyone on earth just from the power that's in the tip of his wing. Therefore, he could have protected Jesus, and there's no reason to have killed a substitute. Could have just protected Jesus. Going along that same line, without dealing with Gabriel, there's just the argument that Allah could have raised Jesus to heaven without having anybody as a substitute for the crucifixion. There's basically no reason to kill an innocent person in order to save Jesus. If you wanted to save Jesus, just save him. The fourth argument is that Allah becomes the author of deception and ignorance. And taken to its logical conclusion, what that ends up meaning is that since Allah deceived Christians into believing that Jesus had been crucified, but in fact he really hadn't been, then there are literally billions of Christians that have taken up that false belief over the years and are therefore doomed to eternity in hell because of Allah's deception. That's just not tenable, even to Al-Razi. The fifth report is that, I guess this would be the sixth report, he repeats a report by Ibn al-Rawandi where he says that there are more Christian reports about the crucifixion than there are Muslim reports about Muhammad. Therefore, if we're going to reject the reports about the crucifixion, we logically have to reject the reports about Muhammad. And poof, Islam's gone.
Those are really good arguments.
Every last one of them. It's strikingly compelling, isn't it?
It's interesting when you talk about some of these commentators from the rationalist tradition, like Al-Razi, did push back against these substitution legends, and it's interesting to see. In some of your book, you'll discuss this, but then they realize the implications of this. Well, if we can't trust our sense perceptions, then what do we do? And then they'll say, well, this sort of thing only happened in the time of the prophets. And then some of them do realize and don't realize a problem with that. Al-Razi realizes the problem with that. But then, which you just highlighted, if let's say that this only happens during the time of the prophets. Well, then you can't trust anything that happened in the time of the prophets. So it's you completely destroy your own foundation for belief. So yeah, those are great objections. So where does Al-Razi go with this in the end?
Well, those are the points he brings up in 355, but when it gets down to 4157, the verse where everybody deals with the crucifixion, he presents half a dozen substitution legends.
That's
He
shocking.
he separates his he has two arguments that are not compatible with one another. So he puts them 100 pages apart.
So Tabari separates his history from his commentary, and Razi separates 355 from 4157.
I hadn't thought of putting it that way, but yeah, that's absolutely superb. That's exactly what's going on here.
So Todd Lawson's book was mentioned earlier, obviously another recent contribution to this field. And I'm going to quote from page 107. He says, although he, referring to Fakhruddin al-Razi, certainly stops short of actually affirming the usual Christian idea that Jesus was put on a cross and killed, al-Razi, in his criticism of the substitution legend, moves considerably toward such a position. And I think you could probably make that argument if you just looked at 355, but not if you looked at 4157. So that seems to be in conflict with what you found in your treatment of Razi.
Right. And that ties into one of the ways in which my thinking ends up in a different spot than Lawson's is that he's put more of an emphasis on those who on the places where Islam agrees with Christianity on the crucifixion, and a little bit less of an emphasis on what the conclusions of their work are. He's right in bringing up all of these places where there seems to be agreement, but those aren't the conclusions.
Very interesting. So we've talked about the grammarians, we talked about Tabari, and then the rationalist approach, or at least al-Razi's version of it. So let's turn now finally to the fourth category, and that would be the Ismaili scholars. So what's different about them, and what do they conclude?
The Ismailis are, let me first identify who the Ismailis are. The Ismailis are Shiites, but they aren't the kind of Shiites, they aren't the dominant strand of Shiites that we have today. Most of the Shiites that are around now are what you would call 12er Shiites, or if not Ashura Shiites. And they're waiting for the 12th Imam to return. The Ismailis are waiting for the 7th Imam to return. And they're waiting for the Imam to return so that he can overthrow and replace the unjust and oppressive rule of the Sunnis. So they're in opposition to the Sunnis. They want a different form of government. They want their Imam on the throne, not the Sunnis. Now, during the mid-10th century, there were half a dozen Ismaili scholars who wrote about the crucifixion. And there have been several different places where their works have appeared in the literature. And sometimes it's characterized as they're affirming the crucifixion, but it's often categorized as they're affirming the crucifixion. But on a more thorough analysis of what they're really doing, not one of these guys is explaining Surah 4, Ayah 157. These are not commentaries. This is evangelistic literature. They're out trying to convert people to their cause. Some of the people they're trying to convert to their cause are Christians, others are Jews. This, at the time that they're doing this in the early 10th century, the Muslim world is not uniformly Muslim. There are still many Christians and many Jews out there. And so that's what they're trying to do. And in finding common ground, they often use the motif of the cross as they're speaking to Christians. But their arguments aren't to affirm the crucifixion. What they're doing in their arguments are one of two things. They're either arguing for the veracity of the Quran, they're arguing for the prophethood of Muhammad, or they're arguing that the Fatimid Caliph should be ruling the entire Muslim world. So they're making arguments for those things. On the other hand, they are sometimes arguing against two different schools of polemical arguments that the Sunnis have, or they're arguing against Neoplatonic philosophy, which they just despised. So they aren't arguing for the crucifixion. It's an entirely different subject matter, but they use the crucifixion, they use the cross as a symbol that the Christian part of their audience and the Jewish part of their audience would identify with. It's a way to illustrate something to one of their prospective members.
Wow. So not even the Ismailis were arguing that the Quran affirms the crucifixion. Did Lawson come to different conclusions there? I don't recall.
Lawson's conclusion is that across the board that Islam does not have an official orthodox conclusive position on the crucifixion. And if you read the 40 or so scholars that he covers, what he ends up saying is that some of these guys deny the crucifixion, some of them affirm the crucifixion, and there's really room for both views within Islam. And that he would put the Ismailis as ones who are supporting or affirming the crucifixion. And for me, it's very easy to see why he would say that. I'm just looking at it a little bit more critically and saying, but they really aren't arguing for the crucifixion at all. They're taking the crucifixion as a premise in an argument that's about something else. And they're using it as a premise to an audience who already believes in the crucifixion. So they aren't arguing for it. They're using it as part of their tool to convert people.
Do you have any feel for how accepted these substitution legends are today?
I would say that they're almost universal, except for a few Western scholars here and there, a few dozen. I would say the substitution legends are almost universally affirmed within the Muslim community. So much so, I can't tell you how many times when I've met a Muslim for the very first time, within the first few moments of a conversation, it'll become evident in one way or another that I'm a Christian. And what they'll say time and time again is, did you know that Jesus has not been crucified? Not necessarily the way I would start a conversation with somebody who had a different viewpoint than me, but over and over and over again, conversations will start on the basis of they're proclaiming that Jesus has not been crucified, and proclaiming it from what they say is an unambiguous verse in the Quran. Yet it's clearly not unambiguous.
Well, let's move more specifically to that verse now. That was a great lead-in. By the way, I guess to Muslims like that, though, you could just respond using Al-Razi's arguments against the substitution legends. But so let's talk about 4:157 specifically. So what does this verse explicitly affirm or deny in your view?
It clearly states that the Jews did not kill or crucify Jesus. Right in the verse it says, and they did not kill him, and they did not crucify him. The they clearly refers back to the people of the book in verse 153. And in the case of the paragraph that stretches from verse 153 through 162, The people of the book that they are referring to is the Jews. It is not the Christians. If you have any doubt about it, what you do is you read the paragraph and you see what the paragraph is talking about. And sorry about that. I thought I had the buzzer off. What's talked about in this paragraph is a dozen sins committed by the Jews. And you read through it, and there's no question that these are not sins that are committed by Christians. These are sins that were either committed or at least attributed to the Jews. Most of them are documented also in the Old Testament. So this paragraph is about the Jews. So the they in verse 153 or 157 refers back to the Jews in 153. So the Jews did not kill Jesus, and the Jews did not crucify him.
What is less clear? Where's the gray area?
The gray area is the grayest area is in the term shubia. It's commonly translated as "it was made to appear like that to them," which is a lot of words when you think about it to translate a single word. So, right off the bat, we ought to suspect that there's something going on here. It's not at all clear that that's what it's referring to.
Another question from Sahih Luke, which goes right along with this discussion. He names a couple of Muslim scholars like Dr. Shabir Ali and Dr. Ali Atai, and they interpret 4175 as not denying the crucifixion, and he wants to know if they make a good case. I think that it's important to ask, crucified by whom? Because no one can argue that the Quran does not say, as you just said, that the Jews crucified Jesus. I mean, the Quran clearly affirms that the Jews did not crucify Jesus. So I assume that these scholars are trying to make a case, perhaps distinguishing crucifixion from the Jews to the Romans or something of that sort. But are you familiar with any of those arguments that they make? And
no, I'm not. I've really studied. The work that I've studied has been primarily between the years 800 and 1200 AD.
Okay.
And it's not as if I haven't heard anything that's been said since then. But I'm not familiar with popular arguments. I have cited some of the scholars like Mahmoud Ayub and Lawson and those, but not the more popular debaters.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with this argument, or is the argument given on the note that was sent your way?
No, but Sahih Luke, if you want to give us some more specifics, if you can condense what they're saying, that would be helpful. I know that some scholars, the article I sent you a couple of days ago does try to differentiate between crucifixion as a Jewish and a Roman practice. And I don't know if some scholars take that route to say that, well, the Quran says the Jews did not crucify Jesus, but it doesn't say anything about the Romans. I would be interested to see if that's where that goes.
I'm not familiar with their particular arguments, but I would say that we know that he died on a Roman cross, and a cross is the means of that the Romans used for crucifixion, whereas the form of capital punishment for the Jews was stoning someone to death and then hanging him by ropes on a gibbet. And so they're different means of execution. And so we can see that Jesus did die on a Roman cross. And there must be a dozen, maybe it's more, verses in the Quran that say that Allah is the only one who can give or take life. And there are verses that are actually refer to incidences where there were Muslims who claimed to have taken somebody's life, and they hear a rejoinder that says, no, you didn't take that person's life. Allah did. And so here it's also easy to say that Jesus died on a Roman cross, and it was Allah who took his life. It's easy to take that position by looking just at what the Quran says and not looking at what commentaries say. Commentaries don't say that, but the Quran would support that argument.
Yeah, the Quran and history. And I think that's another important clarification to it.
Right.
Some scholars will move in the direction, perhaps like you're saying, and then say, well, you can get from that the Quran affirms the crucifixion. Well, no. And as you've commented, the only time the Quran mentions the crucifixion and Christ, it is in denial. So, yeah, if you try to take that option and fill in the blanks, then you can get some sort of a conclusion that's in some way coherent with history. Also, I do wonder if you have, and this will be the last question, if you have any qualms with some scholars who try to make too much of a difference between the Jewish practice. You mentioned stoning, and then you talked about crucifixion as well being a Roman practice. But, in reality, in the first century, it was so much a part of the jurisprudence system of the Jews that Peter would say in Acts 2 that you crucified Jesus. We have Galatians 3:13, we have the temple scroll, we have Josephus, and all of these first century Jews directly connected, as you mentioned earlier, Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23 with the crucifixion. So, I mean, yeah, it's something that the Romans developed more, but it was very much a part of the Jewish jurisprudence system, so much that they could link the Torah directly to it. So I think for some scholars who try to take that route and say, well, no, crucifixion was a Roman thing, I really think if you walk up to Paul when he was writing Galatians and said, when he says, cursed, quotes Deuteronomy, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. I think if someone stopped Paul and said, actually, that's a Roman form of capital punishment, Paul would say, yeah, and just keep writing. So I really don't. I think in some ways that's a distinction without a difference, given the first century circumstances. But those are just my thoughts.
I think I'll end up pretty close to what you're saying, and that is that one of the things that one of the lines of reasoning that's very much in the public square today, and has been for some time, is the idea of being complicit in something. So whether or not the Jews put Jesus on the cross, which we would say that the Romans actually did that, the Jews are complicit in him being on the cross. The Jews are the ones who accused him, and they also had a trial. They took him before their Sanhedrin. The Jews riled up the crowd to crucify Jesus instead of Barabbas. The Jews are very, very much involved in the process. So even if it wasn't the Jews who physically killed Jesus, and if it wasn't the Jews who physically put him on the cross, they're complicit in his death through several of their actions. And so that line of logic, often there's a long line of logic behind what it is that somebody says in a what is it, 140 character Twitter tweet, or that Paul said in a single sentence. There's often something behind that. I would suggest that might be the fact that the Jews are complicit. I would also take your statement of what Paul said in the first century and say that line of thinking, from what I can tell, has permeated Jewish-Christian relations for centuries and centuries and centuries. The Jews were called Christ killers in Europe through, certainly through the medieval period, and from what I would guess, probably through the Renaissance and Reformation, and even into the modern period. So this label of them being the ones who killed Christ is something that really stuck with them. And I would say it stuck with them because they were complicit in it, even if they weren't the ones that physically nailed him to the cross.
Yeah, that's a great point. As we wrap up, could you we don't have time to go into the content, but give viewers just a kind of a hint of your ongoing project so they know what's coming down the line next for you on this topic.
Well, the thing I'm working on after the book is an article that is my own explanation of what the verse means. And I approach it from exactly the opposite angle that the Muslim commentators have approached it. What the commentators have done is that they have these substitution legends, all of which appeared first in print at least a couple of centuries after the Quran was written. And they used this later material to explain what the verses meant to the original audience. What I'm doing, and I hint at this at the very end of my book, is I'm approaching this verse the same way that I would approach interpreting something in the Bible, or how I would interpret something in any piece of literature. I would take a look at it from the perspective of what did it mean to its contemporary audience. Some of that has to do with the grammar, as we've already hinted at, that this is complex grammar. It's not unambiguous. But part of it also has to do with what books does it interact with. And I would say that it does not interact with books that were written afterwards. It doesn't interact with these substitution legends that are a couple hundred years later. But in fact, what it does do is we can find that there are traces of books that were written before the Quran that it interacts with, and interacts with rather directly. And in this new article, I'll be taking passages not only from the Quran, but both the Old and the New Testament, more importantly, from two other books that aren't normally associated with Islamic studies. One would be a Jewish book called The Stories of the Prophets. And these are stories of the Jewish prophets that were composed during the first several centuries after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The other book is one I know that you're familiar with, and from what I can tell, you're actually much more familiar with it than I am. I'm familiar with how it interacts with this one particular item, and that is the Babylonian Talmud, which was composed during the first 5 centuries after Christ's birth. It was composed in Babylon. It was composed on the Tigris River, on the Euphrates River, about 50 miles away from where this whole process of explaining the Quran took place, in Baghdad, one river over. And these two rivers are connected by a canal in that location. I mean, these are sort of like suburbs on opposite sides of town, where the Jewish scholarship took place during the first 5 centuries after Christ, and then a couple centuries later, Islamic scholarship is starting there in Baghdad.
Interesting geographical connection between the Hadith and the Babylonian Talmud, for sure. Dr. Oakes, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the interview. Thank you for the questions.
And thank all of you for watching. Thanks again to my Patreon supporters, as well as the moderators who dedicated their time down in the live chat. Hey, everyone, check out the description box where you can find a link to the book, The Cross of Christ, Islamic Perspectives, as well as a couple other links there to learn more about Dr. Oakes. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.